Tentative title of my thesis is Borrowed from History, the Pleonasm of Meaningful Work. And I'm somewhat provocatively calling meaningful work a pleonasm, as I'd like to make the case for the need to maintain a concept of work that is distinct from the concept of labor. So I'll kind of give a little background of like a high level look at kind of what I'm doing with my research and my thesis, and then I'll probably deliver based on the time part of a chapter that I'm working on within the thesis. So a bit of background, multiple statistics report that today most job seekers are seeking to find what is referred to as meaningful work. And this meaningful work is chosen over higher salary positions oftentimes. And one statistic says that 9 out of 10 people would choose meaningful work over a higher salaried position, according to Harvard Business Review. So these statistics coincide with a workplace investing in physical, mental health wellness programs, robust mission statements and values, diversity and inclusion initiatives, team building volunteer programs and initiatives. These are all indicative features of a modern workplace that is attempting to infuse itself with a sense of meaning and meaningfulness. We are at a time where many people, employers and employees alike, are so bold as to say there is no longer anymore a work life and a personal life, there's just life. So the categories of work and personal, the barriers between work and non-work are collapsing. This phrase, meaningful work, I think marks a profound shift in the lack of distinction between labor and work. When a majority of a surveyed population says they want meaningful work, it's perhaps important to take a closer look at what this term meaningful work could effectively mean as a common demand amongst thousands of surveyed individuals in a society where meaning is referred to as subjective. So additionally, work can at once refer to the positions, offices, jobs, or careers one takes up during their lifetime, while simultaneously referring to one's physical, thereby mental task of working, of spending and exerting one's energy, one's labor. When a 9-to-5 employee before his commute says, "I'm going to work," we can assume he means that he is both going to his workplace to assume his role of employee or worker, and that he's also going to labor. Additionally, work can refer to the accumulated effect of one's labor. In fact, this definition, which operates apart from the more colloquial uses, is most closely defined with the physical sciences definition. Work as the measure of energy transfer that occurs when an object is moved over a distance by an external force. So work can additionally refer to the measurement of force over time. When people say that they want meaningful work, or that we want meaningful work, or whatever, that we would choose meaningful work over a higher salaried position, there's perhaps more going on within this concept than our initial conception. So from this recent demand for meaningful work, I think a philosophical problem emerges. How does today's conception of meaningful work shape, actualize, and recuperate human potential within the workplace and constitute one's labor as meaningful beyond the distinct function of labor? The goal of my thesis is to parse out and nuance the dominant understanding of meaningful work, drawing from and attempting to synthesize the work around sovereignty in the subject and the work of Agamben and Bataille with that of Marcuse around the ritualization of language, the magical and authoritarian sort of moves within what he calls a language of total administration, as well as his concept of repressive desublimation as that relates to the individual. Additionally, I'll be working with the ideas of Marx and Arendt to categorically separate the concept of work from labor. So rather than trying to conclusively answer the question, what is work, I will attempt to trace out how meaningful work perpetuates a mode of thinking, which by its very inclusion of a harmonious pluralism, borrowing again from Marcuse, of meaning and meaningfulness, how this inhibits any historical or material iteration of work, which in turn produces and perpetuates a form of alienation. In order to come to such a conclusion, I will investigate the role of meaning as it operates in conjunction with work. As we can gather from modifier, that there must be something in relation to meaningful work that can be that could be constructed as just mere work, work that is not meaningful. And furthermore, I will consider the ways in which a mode of thinking truth as possessive or possessed by the subject corresponds with a language of total administration, as I mentioned before, which bars the subject from language's transitive or poetic function, as well as the construction of knowledge. And I'll look at the ways in which the construction of knowledge relates to subjectivity and sovereignty. So I'm going to deliver a part of a passage, or part of a chapter that I'm working on. This chapter is called Live Your Truth, the Sovereign Imperative and Repressive Desublimation. And I'm just going to do some of it because this is one that I'm still working on. And it would be nice to get some feedback on it as well. So here we go. One of the points of confusion in the contemporary discourse around meaning and meaningfulness comes from the injunction that meaning is subjective. Contemporary mantras like you do you, live your truth, life is what you make of it, all coincide with a certain iteration of the phrase, meaning is subjective. This phrase by itself does not communicate much content, or perhaps assumes a certain content around the idea of subjectivity. Foucault offers a double meaning to the term subject in that the subject is both dependent and pertaining to identity. However, the use of the term subject or subjectivity varies and can vary. The recognition that everyone has their own truth, for example, a way of thinking which perhaps coincides with the phrase meaning is subjective, possesses within it a contradiction if these truths are to be taken to mean what they could. And I think herein lies the difficulties in thinking of a pluralism which can include as many truths as there are individuals. On the topic of pluralism, Marcuse remarks that today's novel feature is the flattening out of the antagonism between culture and social reality through the obliteration of oppositional, alien, and transcendent elements in higher culture by virtue of which it is constituting another dimension of reality. This liquidation of two-dimensional culture takes place not through the denial and rejection of cultural values, but through their wholesale incorporation into the established order. Through their reproduction and display on a massive scale. So Marcuse's idea of repressive desublimation, I think, illuminates the repressive nature of a societal turn in which the fulfillment of an individual's desire becomes paramount. We can perhaps explore this further in the contemporary mantra imperative, live your truth, which can be seen on t-shirts, social media, etc. This example, I think, corresponds to a way in which a transcendent category such as truth loses its ability for transcendence. So what sort of subject can this imperative, which notably necessitates an other, refer to? It seems clear at first that there's a kind of subject invoked in the imperative, live your truth, that could only achieve the demands of the imperative with a state of harmonious pluralism. So that is, the certain kinds of truths that can belong to the subject of such an imperative as live your truth are those that can be harmoniously pluralistic and are thus indifferent to one another. The subject who possesses truth, in this case, too, owns a distinct reality from the other who delivers the imperative, yet their truth is also excluded and shaped as a possession. So the instances under which the imperative live your truth operates are instances in which the subject's truth is inherently non-confronting towards another subject that would negate the other's truth as truth. The instances in which the imperative live your truth operates on a subject are instances which such a truth would be necessarily indifferent to the other, as the imperative suggests another, even though they are perhaps unseen and unrecognized by the imperative. There is no I. The kinds of truths which would become, by extension, the kinds of meanings or causalities a subject can conceive, produced in such instances of a subjective pluralism of indifference, are then, by the dictates of an unseen other, non-exclusionary. They must coexist, as we sort of mentioned. This quality of non-exclusivity necessarily renders these kinds of truths as fundamentally apolitical or perhaps pre-political and do not arise from discourse, insofar as they are immune to the truth of another as a negating force, and in turn cannot be negated. So where truth as an ideal lies outside beyond the individual, the possessive truth is robbed of a distance which Marcuse says is necessary for a movement towards qualitative change. This collapsing of the distance, this elimination of the quality of negation deteriorates the transgressional, the transpersonal, the transcendental. The imperative to live one's truth collapses the antagonism of the ideal by fulfilling it as a possession of the individual. And this sort of corresponds to that idea of repressive desublimation, which at first might be recognized as a sort of freedom, a freedom to live out a true self. However, there are perhaps two repressive shifts occurring. The first being that specific to, but not exclusive to the case that we're showing, this imperative, live your truth, there still exists a sovereign move, bringing in this concept of sovereignty from Bataille and Agamben, which occurs in the imperative's demand for a truth which is shaped in the moment of its production as pertaining to the individual. The repressing feature of the imperative to live one's truth, or perhaps be yourself, etc., operates from the imperative itself, as the discourse of truth collapses into harmonious indifference. This method works in conjunction with the language of total administration, as it operates on the individual, particularly in collapses the way of abstracting oneself beyond particular circumstances, producing a sort of one-dimensionality. This turn perhaps gets at what Marcuse means when he says that the magical, authoritarian, and ritual elements permeate language and speech. And it's here where I noticed, in reading Marcuse, like thinking about the simultaneous working of the magical and the authoritarian within language. And I think that this sort of serves as a nice bridge or parallel between Marcuse and Bataille and Agamben's discourse around the sovereign. The nature of the imperative, I think, holds within it a sovereign characteristic. And Agamben, following Carl Schmitt, in delineating the paradox of sovereignty, writes, the sovereign is at the same time within and without the juridical order. The juridical order. The nuance at the same time is not superfluous. Indeed, the sovereign, having the legitimate power to suspend the validity of the law, legitimately places itself outside the law, and the law is outside of itself. It is outside of the law. Or I, the sovereign, who am outside the law, declare that there is no outside of the law. This description of the sovereign pinpoints its paradoxical structure at a moment in time. Agamben places specific emphasis on this moment as simultaneous, in which the sovereign at once working outside of a law declares the law as such. So the command or rule instantiated by the imperative is for one to live their truth. However, the truth which one may live as established before has its limitations of which we identified as the negating structure being limited. And the second being that the concept is ritualized and reworked to magically conform its subject to a contradiction. So the sovereign power of the imperative then is the ability at once to define the conditions of truth while seemingly existing within the law. Live your truth operates with this sovereign characteristic by way of legitimating truth as a possession of the subject while obfuscating the conditions of the outside, reaching across the line it has drawn, so to speak, to limit and close down language's poetic function and the way poetics can discourse with the outside. However, we might also say that the move or characterization of truth as possession renders a sovereign feature within the subject, at least insofar as we follow Bataille's characterization of sovereignty. Bataille's acknowledgement of the relationship between knowledge and sovereignty, I think, is key here, as knowledge is never sovereign. Live your truth, in some sense, establishes an element of sovereignty within its subject as it collapses its truth concept from the historical iteration, which brings one back to or conforms oneself into the moment over and over again, which is also the moment of being, as Bataille might say, an animal, wanting with no future. Bataille remarks that the sovereign man lives and dies like an animal, but he is a man nevertheless. So I think I'm going to stop there. And and my goal with all this is to work back in the contemporary workplace, articulating this kind of subjectivity or harmonious pluralism as it relates to the new conditions of the workplace, which place a lot of authority within the worker, him or herself, and or themselves, yeah. So that's kind of what I wanted to share today.